I come to you in the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The passage that we just read from the first chapter of the book of Genesis, a passage written about 2,500 years ago, has played a significant role in the modern contemporary culture war around teaching evolution in public schools. When I was a junior at Flora High School, my biology teacher skipped over the part in the textbook about evolution because, as she said, it was just too controversial. And in one of my earth science classes, I once received 100% credit on a quiz about our solar system by writing, "Because that's just how God made it," in the blank. It's a good thing I became a preacher and not a scientist. Most biblical scholars will tell you that Genesis was never meant to be read as a science textbook. It is, they say, a mythical origin story. And its purpose, unlike what the creation scientists might tell you, is not to disclose the exact method that God used to create the cosmos, but rather its purpose is to reveal the goodness in creation, the goodness of creation, and particularly the goodness of human beings, of men and women created in the image of God. This is supposed to make Genesis chapter 1 more palatable for modern thinking folks. But let me tell you, the proclamation of a good creation right now, after the past few days, after the past few weeks, after the past few months, might seem about as ridiculous as a literal 6-day creation, and about as far-fetched as a 6,000-year-old earth. I don't blame the folks who wrote this text for not knowing about evolution. I don't blame them for not taking into account the fossil record. I don't blame them for imagining a great dome in the heavens that separated the waters above from the waters below. They were not scientists. They were theologians, and so you can't expect them to have taken into account the scientific details. But there are also people like you and me, and so you might expect that they would have looked out into the world and said, "Hey y'all, something just ain't right. It isn't all good. This world's got some major deficits. Floods destroy villages. Viruses kill our friends. Stars fall from the heavens. Volcanoes melt cities. And people murder their brothers and their sisters." You might think that a people who knew all of this would have written a more realistic story of creation. One where God looks at the world that God created and says, "Well, I guess that'll do." Or perhaps on the 6th day, God looks and says, "Well, I suppose done is better than good." Or perhaps God says, "Well, not bad for a first try." That's basically what other folks living in the ancient Near Eastern world said. They imagined the world as sort of a divine accident, and people as an afterthought at best, and a huge mistake at worst. But not these Hebrew theologians. They wrote down these words spoken directly from the mouth of God. It is good. And so you might think, well, perhaps these theologians were naive, or maybe they were sheltered from the harsh realities of the world. And that's why they were able to imagine a good creation. Or you might think, well, perhaps this was written during a time of relative peace and prosperity. And that's why the Hebrews were able to paint such a rosy picture. Or you might think, well, perhaps the Hebrew people enjoyed a tranquil and non-eventful history. And that's why it was easy for them to recognize the goodness of the created order. But that's not the case. This bit of theological imagining, this divine revelation, came to a people living in exile. The folks who said that God looked at creation and God said, "It is good," were struggling to survive as second-class citizens. They had been forcibly deported from their homes. The folks who insisted that people are created in God's image had been victimized by the empires of man, empires that destroyed their temple, trampled their land, and enslaved their people. These theologians were not sheltered. They weren't naive, and they were not living in perfect peace and harmony. And yet they make the bold theological claim that the world that God created is good, and that the people living in that world are created with purpose in the very image of God. When these theologians produce their text, I wonder if they were laughed at. Not for being unscientific, but for being unrealistic. But they stuck to it. They said that it was true. They believed it, and they passed on their claim to their children. They passed on their claim to us. They passed on their radical theological claim that God looked and God said, "It is good." And when empires try to create a world of scarcity, where a few have a lot and a lot don't have much, these theologians and their children point to the text and say, "No, no, no. What you're creating ain't good." You see, God created a world of abundance where everyone can have enough. And God said, "It is good." When police forces try to control the people's free movement, these theologians and their children point to the text and say, "No, no, no. What you're creating ain't good." You see, God formed the dry land for us to walk on and for us to march on. And God said, "It is good." When the rich try to turn the lights out on the poor, lights powered by the sun above and the earth below, these theologians and their children point to the text and say, "No, no, no. What you're creating ain't good." You see, God put the sun up above and the earth below for everyone to enjoy. And God doesn't charge a dime. And God said, "It is good." When men try to treat women as property, as objects for their own sexual gratification, and pay them 80 cents on a dollar. These theologians and their children point to the text and say, no, no, no. What you're creating ain't good. You see, God created women in God's image. And God said, it is good. When kings try to enslave their subjects, when profit is placed over people, and when Cain murders his brother, these theologians and their children point to the text and they say, no, no, no. What you're creating ain't good. You see, God created us. God created people in God's image. And God said, it is good. And so don't think God don't notice when you pay God's good image poverty wages. Don't think God don't notice when you kick God's good image to the curb on the first of the month. Don't think God don't notice when you suffocate God's good image under your knee. Don't think God don't notice when you tear gas God's good image in front of a church so you can take a picture holding the Bible. Don't think God don't notice when you throw God's good image into inhumane workhouses. And don't think God don't notice when you violate God's good image with your acts of violence, white supremacy, and greed. The Hebrew theologians were not concerned with scientific facts, but they knew and they spoke the truth. The truth that God said, it is good. Even though that truth might not be widely recognized or acknowledged. I can fully understand if you're having a hard time this morning believing the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And I'm not talking about that whole 6-day creation bit. I, for all, could roll with that. After all, I graduated from Flora High School. It's the proclamation of a good creation that can be difficult to believe, especially during times like these. God said that it was good, but what about this virus? God said that it was good, but what about these deadly hurricanes that we're supposed to get later on this year? God said that it was good, but what about murder hornets? God said that people are created in God's image, but let me tell you, that image is oftentimes difficult to see behind all that riot gear. I'm having a hard time seeing that image in the man who stood in front of a church holding a Bible. I'm having a hard time seeing that image in folks who act violently in both word and deed towards black bodies. God looked and God said, it is good. And that can be hard to believe, especially during times like these. It can be difficult to use our theological imagination like those Hebrew theologians did over 2,000 years ago. But believing is not always easy. But it is our calling. It is our calling to proclaim the message of Genesis chapter 1, that God said, it is good. It's a message that we need to speak, and it's a message that the world needs to hear. If you didn't already know, yesterday was Trinity's 165th anniversary. And today, Trinity Sunday, is our patronal feast day. And if you look through the pages of Trinity's history, you'll meet a people, a group of theologians, if you will, who have made it a point, time and time again, to proclaim the message of Genesis chapter 1. The message that God looked and God said, "It is good." When other congregations moved west in search of greener pastures, actually in search of wider pastures, Trinity looked around at its neighborhood and said, "Nah, we're not moving." Because God looked and God said, "It is good." When over 60 years a same-sex couple asked Trinity's clergy for a blessing, Trinity said, "Of course we will." Because God looked and God said, "It is good." During times like these, we love and we support one another as members of God's beloved community because God looked and God said, "It is good." During the height of the AIDS crises, when folks were kicked out of their communities, kicked out of their churches, Trinity opened up its doors because God looked and God said, "Folks living with AIDS are created in my image, and they are good." When Trinity decided to respond to a world broken by scarcity, by providing food and groceries to our neighbors, we did it because God looked and God said, "Your neighbors are created in my image, and they are good." When Trinity stands up against the sexism of our president, we do so because God looked and God said, "Women are created in my image, and they are good." When Trinity holds clothing drives for God's trans children, we do so because God looked and God said, "Trans folks are created in my image, and they are good." When we collect signatures to raise the minimum wage and when we stand in solidarity with McDonald's workers, we do so because God looked and God said, "Low-wage workers are created in my image, and they are good." And today, when we proclaim that Black lives matter, we do so because God looked and God said, "George Floyd was created in my image. Breonna Taylor was created in my image. Ahmaud Arbery was created in my image. And they are good. And they deserved so much better." And when we call out those who oppress the people and demand that they do better, we do so out of love because they too are created in God's image. And they do violence to that image. They do violence to themselves when they trample upon their brothers and their sisters. Trinity is not a perfect community, but we do have a history of proclaiming boldly the message of Genesis chapter 1, the message that says God looked and God said, "It is good." We proclaim this not because the world is perfect, but because not everyone yet believes it. And the people need to hear it. Those who disorder our creation and exploit the people made in God's image, need to hear that they are using and abusing God's good creation. And those who have been told over and over again that their lives do not matter, need to hear God say directly to them, you are good. Your life matters. You are created in God's image, and you deserve so much better. So my friends, let's keep on proclaiming the message that God said it is good. Let's keep on proclaiming it until everyone believes it and until everyone starts acting accordingly.